same with regards to when they were commanded to go in to the promised land and slaughter everybody, all the men, all the women, all the children. And, that's why we think sometimes, well, the God of the Old Testament is different than the God of the New Testament. No, the reason that Moses allowed them to do this was not God's will, was because if they don't go in to the promised land and slaughter all the men, women, and children, if they let the people live, those people are still going to worship the foreign gods, and the Israelites are going to get seduced into the pagan worship. And that's exactly what happened. Scripture specifically tells us. They did not kill all the men, women, and children, and then they ended up worshiping the idols of the people they conquered. So when Jesus had the Sermon on the Mount, he's saying this secondary law that was given because of the hardness of your hearts, to try to wean you off of these, wean you off of these evil practices, evil things that you're doing. I'm the fulfillment of it. And all of these concessions, such as divorce and all this, are done away with. That's why he says, you have heard it that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you now. You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you now. Okay? And one of the things, what Jesus is trying to do is saying, he's basically, his teaching is going against what the people of Israel did and where they failed. Okay? So, the Sermon on the Mount goes from chapters 5 through 7. And if you read in verses 24 to 34, he says in verse 25, therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you shall eat or what you shall drink. Okay. Now, I think he's talking about more than just, food and drink. Because, I think, obviously we need more than that. And if you look in the context, he's talking about, spiritual. I mean, before that he talks about laying for yourselves treasures on earth and laying them up in heaven instead. So he's talking more, he is talking about food. He's talking about basically the necessities of life, everything you need. That's what he's saying. He mentions food and drink. Well, for one reason, generally we do need food and drink to live. But the other thing he's doing is he's pointing us back also to where the Israelites failed, because that is what he's come to do away with. When he says in chapter 5, verse 17, I've not come to abolish the law and the prophets, I've come not to abolish them, but to fulfill them. So he's getting rid of all of these provisions that Moses put in because of the hardness of the Israelites' hearts. Go ahead. Oh, Matthew, sorry. Yeah, that's okay. So when he talks about food and drink, I think one of the things he has in mind is he's talking about Meribah and Massah, where they complained that they were going to starve, they complained that they were dying of thirst. And he's saying, basically, how the Israelites have these doubts about God's providential care. Don't be like them. And if you read Matthew 7, chapter 7, verses 7 to 8, where he talks about asking, you shall receive, seeking, you will find, that's also part of the Sermon on the Mount. There's a few other examples I want to pull out from the Gospels. The woman with the hemorrhage and the daughter of Jairus, Mark 5:34. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But ignoring what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. Okay. I think sometimes we have a tendency to trust, like the man in the gospel said, I believe, help my unbelief. But then we let that doubt creep in, that fear creep in. What Jesus says is, just ignore the fear and just do nothing but trust. Okay? If you concentrate all your attention on trust, if you completely trust in God, it's going to shut out anything else. It's going to shut out that fear. It's going to shut out that doubt. Another one, Peter on the water, Matthew 14:22-36. Where Jesus said, the disciples were scared, saw him walking on the water. Take heart, it is I, have no fear. I think in general we can say that if you really meditate on this passage, and I have before, it seems like this is us. And every time we get scared, every time that we tend to fear, Jesus is there. And I think he's saying this, take heart, it is I. In other words, I'm in control. So everything that's happened to you, it's because of me. But don't worry, have no fear, I'm in charge. This is happening for a reason. And that's how we have to look at this. Doubting Thomas is another one. John 20:28. Blessed are those who have not seen, but still have believed. What I'm giving you here, a lot of what I'm giving you here is the fruits of my own contemplative prayer. So don't think this is, straight out of the catechism or anything, but I think it's very valid. So, John 20:28. Blessed are those who have not seen and still have believed. Think about the future. The future is something we cannot see. This passage applies very much to the future. We worry about the future. We have doubts about how God's going to provide. What we have and what Jesus tells Thomas is believe even though you can't see the future. Trust in me. And one last passage from the New Testament, and then I'm going to move on. Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11 talks about faith. It begins by defining faith, what faith is all about. And it says, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And it goes on to talk about the faith of Abel, the faith of Abraham, the faith of Isaac and all the patriarchs. But what comes next in Hebrews? We always have to read things in context. Hebrews 12. What does Hebrews 12 talk about? Anybody know offhand? Talks about suffering. So the man who's going to believe is going to suffer. This goes back to, if you look at Sirach chapter 2, I'm not going to read it, but Sirach chapter 2 talks all about this. If you come forward to serve the Lord, be ready for trials. Now, I said at the beginning, this is kind of a preface, and I'm hopefully going to tie some of this in, but faith and singleness in the single life, I think, go hand in hand. Because I think being with the person God wants us to marry is about trust in his providential care and his providential timing. And it really depends solely on that. And another virtue comes into play. Does anybody know where this word comes from? It comes from the Latin. Passio. You add an end to that when you get passion, the passion of the Christ. The essence of patience is to suffer. And the suffering comes from not having what you want, or having a burden that you want lifted off your shoulders. This is the cross. To be patient is to bear the cross. Mark 8:34. Sorry, I'm throwing out passages left and right. Feel free to look them up after. Probably you won't keep up with them. Mark 8:34, sorry. This is after Peter said to him, when Jesus said, I'm going to suffer and die. He said, no, that's not right, Lord. He said, and he rebuked him, and he said, if any man would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. The cross is fundamental to the Christian life. Okay? If you don't bear the cross, if you don't follow Christ with your cross, then, if you say no to the cross, you're saying no to Christ. Unless you deny yourself, pick up your cross, and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. In other words, without the cross, you can't be a Christian. And there's always going to be a cross. There are always going to be different stations in your life, but there will always be a cross. When I do the stations of the cross, I'll tell you what I like to do. At every station, I like to think of me in place of Jesus. So, for instance, at the 3rd, 7th, and 9th station, where Jesus falls under the weight of the cross, I like to think about how I fall under the weight of the cross, either through self-love or self-pity or impatience or pride. And I like to think about the station afterwards as kind of what motivates me to pick myself up. For instance, station 8 follows station 7. Jesus consoles the other women who, he says, pray, this is in John, pray for your children, and pray for the children of Jerusalem. In other words, he's saying, yeah, I'm going through a lot of suffering right now, but the suffering that these people who are not putting their faith and their love in me are going to go through a lot worse. And so this is where I say to myself, I have to be, even though I fall under the weight of the cross, I have to be there to console others. And if I'm there concerned about others and consoling them, I'm going to be forgetting less about myself. I want to talk about original solitude again. We talked about original solitude, how Adam, before the creation of Eve, was alone before God. Okay. Now this gets back to, Steffi had brought up this point about another person completing us. Okay, I have to clarify this. When I mentioned this, I was trying to get you to understand the differences between men and women and the complementarity. And I said, we talk about how people say the member or the person's spouse completes them. And I meant, basically a lot of people in the world say this, okay? And that's what I was saying. A lot of people say this. But, and that's true. I mean, there are certain qualities that women have that kind of complement men in marriages, and vice versa, men and women, But, even people who are in marriages, they're still in a state of original solitude. Because we're still all alone before God. Because you've heard that saying, there's a God-shaped heart, or a God-shaped hole in the heart of everybody that only God can fill. Well, you can marry, but that marriage is not going to fill that God-shaped hole because only God can fill it. Okay. And if you don't get married, or if you're not married, if you're single, God is perfect. God is everything. God, there's nothing lacking in God. So, all those things that maybe women, compliment men, or the things that men have that compliment women, God can fill all that. God can fill all of that void. And honestly, if we expect, the person we marry to complete us, or, to be the answer to all problems, man, you talk about a burden. Because basically what you're doing when you're saying, this person, I'm expecting this person to solve all my problems, is you're saying, I'm expecting this person to be God. That's impossible.